Okay, everyone, we might as well make a start. So from this week onwards, we're going to be exploring some of the individual social thinkers. So each lecture in some form will be devoted to a particular social thinker, and we're going to try to extract some of the core ideas of the particular individual. So this lecture is devoted to Jacques Rousseau, and before we start, can we identify some of the key ideas and contributions that he made? What were some of the principal ideals of Rousseau that have kind of become so important? Any of the key ideas? So I think it's important first to establish some basic framing. So first of all, it's very difficult to frame Rousseau as a sociologist. Now, why is that? Why can't we frame him as a sociologist? Any ideas why? So there's two reasons. The first is a somewhat obvious one. The discipline of sociology had not been established in the 1700s when Rousseau emerged. So there was no kind of set of principles related to how to study and examine society. This is going to be established, as we look at it on Friday, Auguste Comte, who establishes sociology, and after him he frames it within a particular discipline, how the tools required to examine society, the science of society, had not been established at the time of Rousseau. So he's not using those methods, those principles. The second important part is that Rousseau is fundamentally a philosopher. So he's looking at reality and problems from a kind of abstract perspective. He's trying to understand the nature of society, the nature of human beings, and how that works in a kind of political framework. So you could kind of categorize him as a political philosopher, but certainly he's not a sociologist. So if he's not a sociologist, why are we studying him? Why is he relevant? So the ideas of Rousseau, the philosophical ideas that he presents, especially related to society and its formation, has been influential to many of the social theorists that we're going to look at. So Rousseau is an important figure when we look at the spectrum of kind of social thinkers. Okay, so before we look at Rousseau and some of his ideas, we need to kind of frame it a bit more. And what we need to do is understand that he is basically a social contract theorist. Now, he's not alone in that. There were three prominent theorists in that domain. So we have Thomas Hobbes, who obviously Hobbes, importantly, just to frame it, he wrote Leviathan in 1651. Then you have Locke, John Locke, who wrote two treatises of political government in 1689, I think. And then you have Rousseau, who wrote The Social Contract in 1762. So it's important to put all of this into context, because these three individuals are social contract theorists. Now, what is social contract? Any ideas on what we mean by social contract in its simplest sense? So social contract and the social contract theorists are asking a fundamental question about when, or no, more importantly, why did free human beings consent to be governed? So all of these theories assert there was a state of humanity, there was a period in the state of nature where we were truly free. We were free, autonomous individuals. We had complete and absolute agency and liberty. But we gave that up, or we surrendered our freedom to be governed by a set of laws. So these laws and this system is telling us right and wrong. Why did we give up our autonomy? Why did we give up our freedom to be governed by others? So we lost that autonomy. So if I, in this society, if I want to drive my car, I have to put my seatbelt on. That is a law. That goes against my agency, my self-autonomy. If I don't want to wear it, I have no choice. I have to put that seatbelt on if I want to drive that car. So we have lost our self-autonomy. And this is, in the basic, simplest sense, social contract theory. Yeah? Why is it that we gave up our freedom to join this society? So for Hobbes, his reasoning behind this is that if you look at human beings in the state of nature, he asserts that human beings were wild animals. They were vicious, wild animals that would tear each other apart, and therefore they needed to be tamed. So he argues that it is rational and right for individuals to give up their freedom, their liberty, to be governed by an absolute authority, by an absolute monarch. Yeah? So if we are going to tear each other apart, then we need a strong ruler to keep us civil. So that's his kind of justification for an absolute authority. That's why he claims we gave up our self-autonomy. Now John Locke disagreed, and he said, look, in the state of nature, yes, we were free, but we were not wild, vicious animals. We were, to some degree, driven by our self-interest, and we had calculations. We made things on a kind of cost-benefit, what's harmful, what's not going to be harmful basis. And as a result, out of that came cooperation. So what he argues is that it was rational, in essence, for us to give up part of our liberty to the ruler who would protect certain core individual liberties. So in essence, what Locke was saying is that if you take a cost-benefit approach, take all the most fundamental liberties and draw them to the core. These are the fundamental liberties that we have, like life being sacred, the rule of law, and these things. These are the core, and the ruler will protect these individual rights. We lose certain autonomy and agency, but we retain, let's say, a core set of liberties. So the ruler, the function of the ruler, is to protect the individual rights. So that's why we give up part of our autonomy to gain the kind of protection of certain alienable rights, right? Now, Rousseau disagrees with both Hobbes and Locke. He says, look, we don't have to kind of give up our individual rights, yeah? And also, we don't have to be then completely at the slave of the authority. So what he wants to work out is a system or a social contract that allows us to retain our autonomy, our freedom, but not lose, what we do in society. So the whole aspect, I'm going to go into a lot of detail in relation to that, so don't worry too much now, but that is the core of the social contract kind of argument. And Rousseau's contribution to this is going to be immense. Now, lastly, before I move on, I need to put a bit of historical context to all of this. So Hobbes and Locke clearly existed in the 1600s, right? Now, Rousseau emerges in the 1700s. So there are two very different realities between the experiences of Hobbes and Locke compared to Rousseau. In the 1600s, science is new. Rationalism is new. These are emerging sciences, yeah? So they've not been solidified, they're not wholly agreed upon. But what's happening in the 1600s is a transition from kind of religion to more science, right? So we're becoming more we're shifting. So feudalism is crumbling away, we're going towards a change. By the 1700s, the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution are well underway. So Rousseau, in some ways, is a child of the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment, in its simplest sense, signified faith in reason. That now, basically, we're going to use this new method to unlock the mysteries of the world. that science is going to basically show us how to live, how we're going to be better. But what's interesting, even though Rousseau is a product of the Enlightenment, he is somewhat skeptical of the Enlightenment. So this is why sometimes he's described as a romantic, and from the romanticism kind of school, is because he's skeptical of the use of reason to extract, kind of understand reality. Rather, he says he's skeptical of reason and believes you need to have faith in kind of the instinctual nature of the human disposition, right? So again, we're going to kind of expand on these. Any questions so far? I know that's rushed, but we need to lay the foundation. Okay, so we're going to start, obviously, with a little bit of background related to the early period of Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was born in Geneva in 1712 to a very low middle-class family. Now, importantly, he experiences somewhat of a turning point at the age of 10, where his father has a dispute with the authorities, and basically his family have to leave Geneva and they flee to Paris. Now here, it's a kind of a culture shock for Rousseau, because Paris is radically different in culture, in lifestyle, to the Genevans. So this period marks, in many ways, a deep kind of instability for Rousseau and a degree of isolation, because Paris was much more kind of opulent. It was much more into luxury, while in Geneva, they very much opposed opulence. So very different societies, very different at the materialistic consumer level. Now, what's interesting is this quote by Rousseau, where he kind of tongue-in-cheek describes the difference between a Genevan watchmaker and a Parisian watchmaker. And he says, a Genevan watchmaker, Rousseau wrote, is a man who can be introduced anywhere. A Parisian watchmaker is only fit to talk about watches. What do you think he kind of means by this? This is a somewhat tongue-in-cheek, satirical kind of comment. But what he's trying to state is the reality. The reality is, his father, by the way, was a watchmaker. So he was saying that basically, look, a Genevan watchmaker is fully actualized and fully engaged in civic life. He can have a conversation about watches. He can have a conversation about the cultural arts and sciences. He can have a conversation about the political system and who's ruling and whether they're good or bad. But a Parisian watchmaker only can talk about watches. He's just singularly focused on that, and he doesn't have that connection to the kind of cultural civic life. So this kind of reflects the different realities that he experiences. Now, Rousseau's experiences will shape his philosophy. So a lot of the time he spent in kind of the mountains with very isolated communities, and we're going to see how that shapes to some degree some of his thinking related to the social contract. Okay, the last point before we move on. Rousseau adopted the deism current among the philosophies of his time. So, deism, in its absolutely simplest sense, is the idea that there was a creative entity or creative force that initiated creation. He was the cause. So there was a God, let's say, that created reality, the universe, imbued within reality the laws that allow it to function, things like gravity, but he does not take an active role in creation. Rather, it is external, separate from creation. So Rousseau does not accept the idea of a personal God. What is the function of a personal God? What does a personal God do? So personal God intervenes. It takes interest in its guiding humanity, right? So the personal God becomes a point of worship as well as helping the practitioner and the community, guiding them. But if you take a deist worldview, if God is just the spark of creation, then this has big implications on how we conceive of morality. So how do we conceive of morality? So the religious perspective would be, you have a higher authority, God, this personal God. He tells you or reveals to you how you live, tells you right and wrong, gives you a set of commands and you follow them. But for Rousseau, morality is simply freedom. How is morality freedom? For Rousseau, morality means freedom. The freedom to choose, the freedom of right and wrong. Now this has to be something that the individual extracts from nature. So if there is no higher authority and there is no inherent value in objects, then it is for the individual to use his agency to extract the good from nature. So what that means is that in essence, we define the good and the bad for ourselves. The human mind becomes the source of morality, not God, as a result. So, okay, these are all the kind of preliminary stuff that we need to kind of get out of the way when we look at Rousseau. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so a turning point in the career of Jean-Jacques Rousseau is him entering an essay competition. So in 1749, the Mercure de France, which is a newspaper, had an essay writing competition, which was the custom at the time. And the question that they posed to the Western audience is this: has the establishment of the arts and sciences contributed to the purification or the corruption of morals? So this was the question posed. Now I need to probably put a little bit of a context to this. At the time, in the 1700s, the common view was the evolutionary method, which meant that most people believed human beings were progressing and evolving and becoming better. Our societies were becoming better. One of the reasons for that is because we had kind of transitioned or abandoned religion. Religion was kind of causing us to be anchored to irrationality. It was anchored to ignorance. Now, how was it anchored to irrationality? So religion distorts our source of thinking. How does it do that? Because it creates the kind of unreal, something that cannot be proven by the mind. Sense perception cannot prove the supernatural. And the supernatural is something then that takes you away from this reality. So in essence, religion creates irrationality, and we were transitioning to science, which was using empiricalism, which was using the mind and sense perception to prove what was true. So it's anchoring us to this physical reality. So with the advent of science, what happens? We have an advancement in technology, right? We become much more rich. We become much more powerful. The Western world starts to colonize the lesser civilization, cutting through these civilizations. Well-established civilizations like the Indian civilization, the Islamic civilization, the Chinese civilization. Western Europe cuts through them with its technology and advancement. So there's the idea that this is progressing. We are becoming better as a people, as a humanity. We've adopted science. We're progressing in society, in our development, in every kind of sphere. We are progressing. So we are naturally becoming morally better because we've left behind the kind of ignorance and savagery that was the past, the medieval past. But Rousseau, surprisingly, disagrees with this. And his response to the essay question, which wins, he answers it in the negative. So usually the custom is, oh yeah, of course, it's done amazing, these things, to answer it in the positive. So why did he believe that the advent of the modern world had actually caused a decline in morality? Why? How? How could it? We're advancing, we've got this new way of thinking, we're becoming technologically more advanced. How can this lead to a decline in morality? Any ideas why he believes this? So ultimately, what he asserts is that we had natural needs, right? This is in the state of nature. We had natural needs. This was our true self. We were in alignment with nature. But as we entered the modern world, we adopted artificial needs. And these artificial needs are not truly in line or in alignment with our true self. And ultimately, as a result of this creates, in the modern, corruption and moral decline. We will explain all of this in more detail. So it's just laying the kind of foundation, right? So we come then, after this kind of famous essay, we come to Rousseau's first two contributions, his two first books. The first discourse on arts and science, and the second discourse on the origins and foundations of inequality. Within these two books, he lays the foundation of something that is important to his thinking and to his philosophy, the state of nature, this ideal point in reality. So, in this as well, what he argues is that humankind, and we're going to go into the details of this, emerges through four distinct states of development for human being, kind of like progressive stages. So the first state is in the state of nature. This is where we are truly free. This is our true state. This is our innate state. This is where we are truly ourselves. But then we enter into kind of like social organizations, not society yet, but kind of like tribes and other things. Then we go into kind of like political structures form and families, and then we get to the modern. All right? And ultimately, when we leave the state of nature, this is where we start to see a decline in morality. So we have things like obviously emerging here, like the division of labor, right? And ultimately what he asserts is this modern world is where corruptions form. This is where we have inequality forms, right? So we need to understand what are the roots of this inequality, how do they form in the modern world, how do they cause a decline in our morality. So we'll take two slides and we're going to look at the state of nature. So the first aspect of the state of nature is what Rousseau says here. He says, describing the state of nature, he says, there are two principles prior to reason, an interest in welfare and preservation, and a natural repugnance at seeing any other sensible being suffer pain and death. Compassion. What does he mean by this? What is he trying to say? So, first thing, in the state of nature, this state of nature is pre-society. What does that mean? Pre-society. It is also before reason, as he says here. So what does that mean? We existed in a state of nature before society, and we had no reason at that time. So what was our drive? What was our impulse? Well, the two impulses that he identifies is self-preservation and this kind of compassion or pity for others. So this was kind of our innate basis. This was our innate kind of impulse. Now in society, when society forms, we have basically what laws, we have fixed relationships, and we have, like you could say, a system, right? We argued this last week. Now, something had to have become lost. We lost something as we transitioned out of the state of nature into civilized society. And that aspect is what we need to try to understand. So Rousseau asks, what were the qualities? What did we kind of lose? What did we have before we became a product of society? So in society, what do we have? We have things like class structure. We have things like money and power, and these all create imbalances. we have competition with each other. But what did we have before in pre-society, when we weren't connected in these fixed relationships? Because we need to find out what we've lost. Yeah? Why was this the ideal state? Now, Rousseau describes this first state in these terms. He says, no desires in the first state. So he's describing us as human beings in the state of nature. He says, we had no desires beyond his physical wants. The only goods he recognizes in the universe are food, a female, and sleep. The only evils he feels are pain and hunger. Obviously, he's writing in the 1700s, so there's a degree of kind of patriarchal aspect to the language. Ignoring that for now, what is he trying to say here? What is the impulse? What is the drive of the human being in the state of nature? Yeah.
Just like the necessities.
Just like the necessities, exactly. So, in essence, we are driven simply by our organic and instinctual needs. We just need to eat, we just need to sleep. That's our base instinct. There's no space for reason and rationality. We're just basically surviving. And so, in essence, we're kind of like in this primitive form, right? You could say kind of like bucolic animals, sometimes it's described as. What that means is we're just basically after our basic needs and instincts. Food, kind of, that type of stuff, right? So the basic needs and instincts. Now, in that state, yes, we are driven simply by our organic needs, but what manifests are two things which he's mentioned. So we can describe it again. We have amour de soi, which is your love of self or self-preservation. That's your innate aspect. So amour de soi is something innate within that need that you have to kind of survive, to keep yourself alive, right? So that drive, that is innate within us. And also the other is pity for others. We have compassion. You don't want to see other human beings suffer. We all know what it's like to go without food. When you feel hungry, you feel those kind of pains. You don't want to see, when we see some, starving children in Africa, why are we all touched by that? We all no one feels like happy when they see that. They feel this kind of sense of, oh, you don't want to see that. Yeah, I don't want to see young children in Africa starving and dying and all these types of things. So we are agitated by that because we have this natural also compassion or humanness for others. Yeah, we don't want to see our human species suffer. So these are the inherent aspects of the first state, right? So this is in the state of nature. I should have said this is where we are truly autonomous, completely free. Yeah, there's no rules. We are completely autonomous individuals. This is the freest we have been. So then the question is, okay, what comes next? The second state. So here, the second state, Rousseau says, as population growth leads to increasing contact between humans, perception of difference leads to comparing and language, produced a kind of reflection or a mechanical prudence which would indicate to him the precautions most necessary to his security, learn to cooperate, form families, and property, weapons, and shelter. So what's happening here then, in this second stage? So in the first stage, the human is very much like a hunter-gatherer. He is or she is isolated, right? Isolated, wandering the forest, foraging for food, hunting, surviving. That's the first stage. But then we go to the second stage, where there's kind of a population growth. So what happens here is possibly we may form tribes. We have kind of families and we have aspects of property, right? So we're forming very small tribes type associations. Some form of social organization and cooperation. So what starts to happen here is that what's important for what Rousseau is identifying is when we start to kind of form different associations, we start to recognize difference. Now, why is the recognition of difference so important and perhaps negative? So we start to see, well, look, the guy in the hut over there has a much bigger hut, has much better weapons. And so we start to compare with each other what that person has, what I have. And this creates, obviously, a sense of want, the kind of materialistic want in many ways. So we start to kind of recognize difference, we start to compare, but we start to compare in negative terms. So things like pride, things like jealousy start to kind of emerge. Now, interesting, he also says that languages form in this second state, probably through things like commodity exchange. So tribes trading, needing languages to communicate, cooperate, and so forth. Things like, obviously, property, families start to possibly emerge here as well. What's really interesting, though, is the second quote that Rousseau says. So here he says, the first man who, having enclosed a piece of land, thought of saying, this is mine, and found people naive enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. What's he saying here? In some ways, what he's saying is property is literally fraud. How is that? So basically, I walk along, find this big patch of land, and I say, well, you know what, I'm going to say this is mine. This all patch of land that is in nature is mine. And then other people come along and for some reason recognize that this is my land. And so through these people recognizing this property that I've just taken, it justifies it, it makes it real. So this land now becomes mine through recognition by others. So in essence, property emerges in some ways like that. So he critiques it in many ways. And this is, in some ways, how civil society perhaps functions in that kind of competition perspective. Okay, so then the third stage is moving towards the political. This is where we form more solidified family structure and political structures and ritual. So this is an important stage because this is a stage where, okay, before the second stage we had these tribes, right? Now what happens is a lot of these tribes bound together into a larger community. Now in the tribal society, when you encounter the stranger, you have two options, either fight or flight, right? So if you are a small isolated tribe and you see someone you don't know, that's a danger. So either you fight them and kill them, or you run away. That's what happens in small tribes. They either run away or they fight. But now you're a part of a larger community. Now how do you bind people together? You can't now, you're encountering the stranger all the time. So you can't respond by fight or flight. So what happens is what? How do you solve that problem? How do you bind this bigger community together? What do we need? So we need possibly laws, right? To tell people, hey, don't kill, don't steal. And this is where some have argued organized religion comes from. So in essence, okay, you've got this community, you want to bind them together. You don't want them stealing. You don't want them killing. So you create law, but what's going to make someone follow a law that says, thou shalt not steal? There's no mechanisms yet in place that really can have courts and judges and things like that. So how do you bind someone to a law? Religion will bind you to it. So if you basically steal, you basically will be punished in this metaphorical afterlife. So that compels you to follow the law. Why do you think in all civilizations when they emerge, with all different religions, whether it's the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Indians, the Abrahamic, they all have a moral code. The Egyptians have like 52 sins that you cannot do. And if you look at them, there's like adultery, there's stealing, there's murder. Things to do with society, right? So we can see that religion is also created in this third stage, or organized religion, and you have political structures to kind of make it all kind of reality. So any questions so far? So now we move to the fourth stage or state. This is where he describes it as the great revolution of agriculture and metallurgy. Oh, I can never pronounce that word. So basically the science of metals and producing metals and all of that. Usher in the evil state of the present. From the moment it appeared advantageous to any one man to have enough provisions for two, equality disappeared. Property was introduced, work became indispensable, meaning you had to work to survive, to earn, and vast forests became smiling fields, which man had to water with the sweat of his brow, and where slavery and misery were soon to germinate and grow upon with the crops. So this is modern society, right? So this is the fourth stage, this is the modern. And here we have all the kind of corruptions that really Rousseau is talking about. Now in some ways, this isn't really a historically accurate picture of human development. This is an abstract philosophical kind of how we came about. And so more than likely, there is an overlap between the third and the fourth stage. Now, when he talks about Great Revolution, about 10,000 years ago, there was a huge shift in human evolution. We went from the Paleolithic era, where we were just hunter-gatherer tribes, into settled agricultural communities, into the Neolithic era. So in essence, that was triggered by farming and agriculture. We become much more advanced civilizations as a result of farming. Now, what he's talking about, however, is the negative aspect of all of that. So what starts to happen is in this modern society, we start to copy people, we start to mimic others, and ultimately through mimicking, we have competition. Now, in essence, what is created here is a distorted sense of self-worth. Our self-worth, how we view ourselves, is created by placing ourselves in opposition to others. So in essence, how I value myself is how others perhaps see me. So in essence, we've created a distorted perspective of you, because now we are competing, we're comparing, we're in this kind of state of competition. So a better way of kind of explaining it is this, what happens here. So we said, in the state of nature, we have amour de soi, which is the love of self or self-preservation. Now, when we enter modern society, amour de soi is transformed into amour propre, which is self-worth. Now, self-worth, like we said, is a value or a sense of identity that we artificially create based on competition and comparing and difference that we see in society with amongst us, all right? So in essence, what starts to happen is we create these identities of difference through negative social interactions, and we create things like, obviously, you have status, you have rich, you have poor, you have power imbalances. Now what starts to happen here is through competition, we start to see ourselves in negative terms to others. So let's say, for example, I see my neighbor, he has this brand new BMW. I'm jealous. He goes out, shines it every day, he's very proud of this new car. So these types of comparisons that we make are very destructive on us. And so in essence, what has happened is we've lost our love of self. Love of self only existed in the state of nature, and now we have basically this self-worth where we see ourselves as others see us through this kind of lens of competition. Is there any questions? I'm going to try to run through this quickly because we're running out of time. So the Native American is an example of this. So basically, cutting it very short, in the 16th century, there was a view that the Native Americans were materialistically very simple, but psychologically quite advanced. So what that meant is because they had very little materialistic needs, they were content living in these small knit groups. They were egalitarian, meaning there's no class structure. They had a very nature-based approach. But when the Europeans came and they had contact with Europe, the whole status system of the Native Americans changed. They started to get exposed to new technology, luxuries and opulence. And what starts to happen is they start to change their wants. So before, they were very simple in their wants. It was nature-based wants. They were in line with Amar de Soi. But when they saw all these other things that they could have, alcohol, weapons and things, they craved it. And through this wanting of these other material things, they started to fight each other. They started to have conflict with each other. And, things like suicides went high, you had alcoholism and all these other problems. So we can see that basically how they went from this natural state, and when they arrived, or the modern kind of technologies and thing came to them, it corrupted them. So this is kind of an example of that. Okay. So we're really kind of running out of time. So I'm going to try to get through some of the basic core points, but I think at some point we'll have to retouch this because it's gone much slower than I thought. All right, so we've now arrived finally at the social contract. Now the social contract opens, obviously with the famous line, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. What does that mean? So obviously man is born free in the state of nature. Soon as they enter civilized society, they are enslaved by it and placed into chains. So what are these chains? These chains are of two types. There is the type that we create through this self-worth, that we create this competition, we create rivalry, we create difference, and then there are also the laws, because we lose our self-autonomy. Now, the social contract begins ultimately with a critique of different ways of organizing society. This is very much a critique of Hobbes. He doesn't mention Hobbes by name, but it's a critique of Hobbes. And ultimately, there are two types of ways of organizing society. He looks at others, but we'll just touch on these two. The natural authority and the right of the strongest. In some ways, what Hobbes and others argued, that there is a natural authority. If you take it, it's kind of analogous to the family. So a family has a rigid structure. You have the father at the top and the children, right? And the children have to obey the father. That is a kind of natural authority. The ruler is kind of imbues that. So he has the right to rule because of that kind of social structure. The right of the strongest is this idea that you need a strong ruler to basically bring stability and order. Now, jumping ahead, Rousseau refutes these points very simply. He says things like, look, the issue of natural authority based on this dynamic between father and child is ridiculous, because obviously the child becomes self-autonomous and independent of the father and family structure. So it doesn't really apply. Again, issues with the right of the strongest. Sometimes might alone, you can't just rule and govern with might. Yeah. So I'm going to jump ahead because we need to move ahead. So what we need to look at is Rousseau's conception, kind of the social contract, right? So in essence, Rousseau is saying that, look, none of these other ways of organized society work, because they don't maintain that kind of what we lost in the state of nature. So the ideal human is the one that has love for self, i.e. amour de soi, and pity for others. This has been transformed and lost in the modern society. So how do we kind of regain it, and how do we make basically things right again? Now, Rousseau argues that for us to have this kind of political structure, there had to have been some form of collective agreement, all right? So before we enter this society and before we gave up our liberty, we must have had an agreement or a pact that basically, before you had a ruler, before you had the law, you have to have had a social agreement prior to the decision-making kind of process. So in essence, what he's saying is we have an agreement that this is going to happen, right? That we're going to be governed in this way. So there is this kind of social contract. Now here he says, then basically how to find a form of association which will defend the person and goods of each member with the collective force of all, and under which each individual, while uniting himself with others, obeys no one but himself and remains as free as before. How do we maintain our self-autonomy, freedom, liberty when someone is making the law for us, when we have these kind of issues? So what we need to work out is, I'm going to jump slightly ahead to basically, we need to understand that for Rousseau, an important point is where authority resides, or sometimes what he refers to as sovereignty, the sovereign. Where does authority reside? Now, in the social contract, what it suggests is that we give up our right to govern so that we can basically live collectively together, right? Now, for Rousseau, authority doesn't reside inherently within the ruler's hands. So it has to reside with the people. The people are the force that create a relationship that allow the ruler to govern. So the people can take back their authority at any time. Now the way this all basically functions is through something called the general will. Now the general will is probably the more important concept when it comes to the social contract. So the general will, I think the best way to explain it is, if you think of it, it's basically universal participation, all right? It's not individual will. Individual will is based on your own self-interest and your own decision-making. The general will is about the collective, making decisions that are good for all. So the first thing that we need to do with the general will is what Rousseau does is be very clear of what isn't the general will. So what isn't the general will is consensus. What isn't the general will is majority rule. And what isn't basically the general will is basically the sum of private wills, if that makes sense. These things are not the general will. Consensus is basically like Locke said. We basically agree upon cost-based approach, the core individual rights, and we basically have to sacrifice a whole load of other rights, but we keep the core. This is like a consensus. Majority rule is highly problematic because you have the vast majority ruling, and that marginalizes a minority group. The sum of private wills, if you look at it, if you take, for example, the UK, 90% of the wealth is held by 10% of the people. That group has huge power because they have the wealth. So they can dictate a lot what happens in society, especially at the economic level. So what the general will is basically the universal kind of agreement in many ways. The thing is, I can't explain it in 2 minutes. So I think what we'll have to do is we're going to have to stop here. We'll have to have a session. Either I'll start a comp session a bit afterwards and then we'll see. But there's a few things that we still need to talk about. I'm sorry, I just for some reason run out of time. Because it's jumping ahead too much, and we need to break it down a little bit more to make sense of it. Because the general will is the core concept, and I can't really rush it. So let's touch base again on Friday. We might quickly recap it in simple terms, and hopefully it will make sense. And then we'll wrap up Rousseau.